Hello,
Hi,
Toby. How are you?
good, thank you.
Excellent. Now, are we ready? I think we're good to go on the Mâconnais. Over to
Great.
you.
Well, welcome everyone to this little sort of seminar on the Mâconnais. I personally love the Mâconnais. I think it's an area of, in Burgundian terms, very good value for money. And you can buy really lovely, world-beating wines, I think, between 10 and 30 pounds a bottle. And I think they stack up with anything that's being made around the world. It's an area that is dominated by the co-ops, and there are some that are good and some that are less good. But there are also a lot of really interesting domains, and for me, that's where the real excitement is. To try and situate the Mâconnais, Mâconnais is in the south of Burgundy. The Mâconnais sort of starts about 35, 40 miles south of Beaune. It sort of starts at Tournu and goes just south of Mâcon. And basically, compared to, say, Chablis in the north, as you go further south, it gets warmer. So on the whole, the Burgundian, the Mâconnais wines are really quite ripe and rich and round. There are quite a few nuances of terroir because there are slightly higher altitude, cooler sites, as well as warmer, richer ones. But in general, it's a little bit softer than the wines. It's much softer than the wines you find in Chablis, and a little rounder than the wines you find in the Côte d'Or, the Meursault, so Saint-Véran and so forth, because it's further south. A lot of the wines, particularly Mâcon-Villages, which is one of the better appellations. There's a generic Mâcon, but for me, on the whole, we start with Mâcon-Villages, which can just be called Mâcon-Villages, or it can have the name of the commune. There are, I think, 27 communes which can attach their name to it. You know, things like La Roche-Vineuse or Midi-la-Martine, and so forth. And for example, our white Burgundy is a Mâcon-Village, which is put together for us for a negociant called Aujoux, and it's an unoaked wine. It's about £10.95. So around that sort of price, you know, I think we do. Some of you may know the Talmar Mâcon-Village, which is currently out of stock because we get a certain quantity, but unfortunately it doesn't last the whole year. It's so popular. And we have another very good one from Jean-François Gonan. I think we might have a photo of Jean-François. And he's way up in Vergisson, and he has a very, very nice wine called Mâcon la Roche-Vineuse. And that's Jean-François, and behind it, that cliff is the Roche de Vergisson. The great Hugh Johnson said the Mâconnais ends in a tempest of wave crest-shaped hills. And indeed, seen in profile, particularly the two dramatic rocks in Pouilly-Fuissé in the south of the region, La Roche de Vergisson and the Roche de Solutré, do look like an unfurling wave crest. And particularly Solutré is famous for Stone Age settlements. And I think that the Stone Age man herded the deer, and the Roche de Solutré sort of ends, it's like a triangle that ends in a point. And I think Stone Age man drove deer over the cliffs and collected them afterwards. Sort of brutal way to hunt, but very effective. So, you know, I think those wines, for example, you know, as I said, terroir, which is about 11.95, gone on, which is about the same. You know, they're unoaked wines. They're fermented in tank, and they have a certain richness, so they don't really need, you know, much oak. They're kept on their lees in tank into the spring. Telmar bottle, sort of April, May. We're just about to get our 220 arriving soon. Jean-François Gonon, La Roche-Vineuse. He's slightly higher up in altitude. It's a slightly fresher wine, so he prefers to keep that wine on its lees for a bit longer. I think he bottles sort of July, August. So those are two very, very attractive wines, and then the Society's wine as well. I mentioned, in fact, that there are nuances of terroir, so to speak. One of the highest points of the Mâconnais is Milly-la-Martine, and we have a couple of wines from there. One from Christophe Cordier. We might have a photo of Christophe if you can find it, but not to worry if you can't. Christophe Cordier ferments that wine in a foudre. There he is. Very dynamic guy, leads from the front, has got about 30 hectares, has Mâcons, Saint-Véran and Pouilly-Fuissés. And he ferments in foudres, which is nice, sort of, you know, it's large oak. So with these little wines, you don't really want them to be swamped with oak. So a large foudre allows a little bit of oxygen in, which you don't get in a stainless steel tank. And as I've said before in perhaps other seminars, Chardonnay really benefits from a little bit of oxygen in its maturation as it develops the flavors. It doesn't have a lot of its own aroma. So it's a very interesting technique that you get a little bit of oxygen through the staves of the foudre. But the foudre is, you know, is kept for 10, 15, 20 years. So there isn't really any oak element, any flavor from the oak. But you get very, very nice micro-oxygenation, which just develops the flavors on. So very, very nice. Also, Frédéric Bourrier, we might have a photograph of him somewhere. He also has some very, very good wines called Domaine de la Rochette, and they're very close to one another. Yeah, Frédéric's on the right there with his lovely DS. I've rather cut off the hills, but the one on the right is Vergisson. And on the left, that's him in his cellar, drawing wine from a pièce, a 228 litre barrel. And you can see the limestone. This is in his cellar, but you can see the his chateau sits on a plateau of limestone, and that's the limestone. So yes, Frédéric too bought Domaine de la Rochette a couple of years ago, and I've been astonished by the quality. And he's got two properties, two vineyards, which are only about a kilometre apart, but they straddle two appellations. He has Monsard Mâcon-Boussière, which Jancis wrote up very well, and I'm afraid it's just sold out. And we did an email offer of its sister wine, if you like, which is actually Milly-la-Martine and called Montagne de Cras. And that means Cras means cray or limestone, and that's a limestone slope. And Mâconnais is a mixture really of clay and limestone. And this vineyard site, Montagne de Cras, is very high in limestone, and so you get a very mineral, fresh edge, and it's also quite high up. And it's like its sister wine, Monsard, is a little bit lower down, has a bit more clay, and so you get a slightly broader, richer wine. And they're both fermented in barrel, 2 to 8 litres, and 2 to 8 litres and 600 litre wines. They're about £15 a bottle, and I think they're really exciting wines. sorry, we're currently sold out of those, but we will have more coming in. Mâcon-Villages plus the name of the commune, you know, lovely wines, you know, around 10 to 15 pounds, some made with oak, some without, but I think they're, you know, really top quality wines and absolutely delicious. If we move down a bit, I mean, I'd also like to talk a little bit about Viré-Clessé, which is a relatively recent appellation, started in '98. It's about 400 hectares. And around Viré-Clessé, there's a cluster of really interesting producers. We have a little shot of a church on a hillside, which is actually in Can 10. We might just show you that because it gives you a little idea of the sort of rolling landscape. I think the Mâconnais is sort of like Wiltshire with sun. You have sort of rounded hillsides and still quite a lot of hedges, you know, which I think is very attractive, and you don't see much in the north of France. So it's very attractive hilly countryside. Yeah, that's the church of Canten, and Canten is just about 2 kilometers south of Viré. And here there's a very interesting cluster of producers. We deal with Guillemot Michel, who were a fantastic domain, just 6 hectares. They're biodynamic. And they really live the life of the biodynamic sort of domain. You know, they have their own garden. They garden biodynamically. They make their own bread. They buy organic bread and so forth. And they have very old vines, low yields, and make wonderful concentrated wine. So if you get the chance to taste the Viré-Clessé from Guillemot Michel, it's about £22, but I think it's worth it. No oak, but wonderful concentration, and often the lovely lemony freshness as well. But they're fantastic. It's Canten is a little village, and it was home to a historically famous domain owned by Tavernet called Domaine de la Mongrand, which some of you may know about. And this Viré is quite a warm spot. Now I was talking about Midi-la-Martine, Mâcon-Boussière, which are quite cool. Viré is really quite a warm spot. It's quite close to the river. And 30, 40 years ago, or actually even longer, I think in the 20s, it actually made some botrytized wines or very late harvest wines. And they were called lèvreté, which means, you know, the color of a hare, lièvre. Because when the grapes go very mature, they go a very dark brown, which is like the color of a hare. And sometimes it's just late harvest, and sometimes it's with botrytis. But because it's so warm, this place used to have a late harvest and harvest very ripe grapes. This before global warming was amazing because you know, in those days one struggled to get to 12 or 13 degrees and chaptalized, and very actually made very rich wines, which were highly prized at the time. I've occasionally bought some Tavernet wines. I think the slight oddness about them is that they can have like between 6 and 15 grams of residual sugar. And you never know quite what you're getting because there's no system of labeling for the sweetness, you know, like Vouvray, which has sec, demi-sec, moelleux. That doesn't really exist. So sometimes you're not quite sure. It's a bit like Russian roulette. You're not quite sure what you're getting. And it's quite difficult to place a wine with 6 or 15 grams of sugar. The producers always say, I drink with foie gras, but you know, how often do you eat foie gras. But anyway, they're a famous domain and very interesting. In the village itself of Viré, there's a company called Bonhomme, André Bonhomme, and I think we may have a photo of Aurélien Palte, who makes the wine and is André Bonhomme's grandson. And whilst we've been talking about wines that are sort of quite ripe, what was very interesting about Bonhomme was that he actually harvested his wines relatively early. That's Aurélien Palte. And the wines are really quite firm and they last fantastically well. And some of you may have bought the Viré-Clessé Cuvée Spéciale, which is sort of 50 to 75-year-old vines. I think it's about £100 per 12 on Primeur, and it will last 8, 9, 10 years and develop wonderful complexity. And André Bonhomme always used to look at the pH of the grapes and always try and pick when there was a certain acidity. So, even within the Mâconnais, there are house styles and you can pick slightly earlier. So Bonhomme was famous for this firm, steely style, which is really age-worthy, fantastically well priced. I mean, I think that's one of the best value wines that we offer all year. The people are so modest and they're really working with quite low yields, compared to, say, Meursault. And they're really trying hard. And I always like spending time in the Mâconnais. After you spent a bit of time in the Côte d'Or, who are the sort of, you have to bow down on one knee to get your allocation, and you can't argue and you can't discuss anything. You get your allocation and you pay the price. In the Mâconnais, they're very keen for your business and keen to talk to you and offer you volumes and so forth. So it's a nice sort of different relationship as you head further south. As I said, a lot of the wine is made by the co-ops at quite low prices. So the good guys making slightly better wine have to fight to sell at those prices. But in my view, many of them offer amazing value for money. Okay, so do look out for Viré-Clessé. As I said, we have wines from Guillemot Michel. We have wines from Bonhomme. And actually both, you'll hear me referring to Christophe Cordier and Frédéric Bourrier a lot, because they're probably our biggest suppliers. And they're quite large domains. They have about 30, 40 hectares. And they have a lot of vines in different places, either owned or they often manage the vineyards and buy the fruit. And so both Christophe Cordier and Frédéric Bourrier also do a Viré-Clessé wine. Fred Bourrier's is really big and rich and powerful. It's very, very delicious. Yeah, up there in the northern part. As I said, look out for Viré-Clessé. Moving down to Saint-Véran, which I'm going to talk about. Saint-Véran is right in the south, and its vineyards sort of intertwine a bit with Pouilly-Fuissé. And actually, I didn't know the reason why some vineyards were classified Saint-Véran and some were classified Pouilly-Fuissé. And I was speaking to Fred Bourrier this morning, and actually he told me a very interesting story, which I didn't realize, is that Saint-Véran used to produce mainly red wines. So when the ENAO which is the board that makes up the rules and defines and makes up the rules for the appellations. Because Saint-Véran, and also, that Saint-Véran, which is around Davayé and Pouilly-Fuissé, and Davayé have some wonderful slopes. But in fact, because it made red wine, there was no history of quality. And the ENAO is a very sort of conservative body, and only grants appellations after many, many years and many, many decades of study and time for vineyards to establish their credentials, which is fair enough. But actually, for me, Saint-Véran, which is, normally something like 14 to 20 pounds, some of those are as good as Pouilly-Fuissé's, which has the top sort of reputation in the region of the Mâconnais. That's the top appellation. So Saint-Véran for me is a really interesting buy. As I said, there are many, many good producers, particularly around Davayé. And it's the same limestone, clay soils that make up Pouilly-Fuissé, but simply it didn't have a long history of producing white wine. So that's a tip from me, is to try and buy some of the best Saint-Vérans. It's not a very big appellation. It's sort of, well, it's 700 hectares, and I think Pouilly-Fuissé is 800. I mean, we've historically been dealing with a very nice domain called Saumez, Jackie and Nathalie Saumez, who are in Vergisson, and they have a number of really wonderful Saint-Vérans. En Crèche is one that we do. It's about 15 pounds unoaked. It's absolutely lovely. Fred Bourrier, yes, him again. He has a lot of vines in a very interesting village called Chasselas. We have 2 or 3 wines from him there. There's one called Vernay, which is at the bottom of the slope, which is actually very fresh and firm and quite steely. And he doesn't oak that just gets fermented in the concrete tank. And the top one from there is En Faux, F-A-U-X, and that's at the top of the slope, sunny. Christophe Cordier makes one there. And those are maybe 17, 18 pounds. The top ones, the Vernay, is about 16.50. But those rival some of the best Pouilly-Fuissés. So I think that those are a very, very good buy indeed. Sorry, just looking down at my notes. Yeah, great. And perhaps finally, we come to Pouilly-Fuissé, which is the sort of top appellation of the Mâconnais. I don't know if maybe we can see that photograph. Yeah, Fuissé and Pouilly. Behind that, you can see the village of Solutré, and that's the Roche de Solutré. And maybe if we go on, we may see another one of Château de Beauregard in the plain. I don't know if you can get that one up. But Pouilly-Fuissé is composed of, yeah, thank you very much. Maybe, Tim, you could just use your cursor and point to the property in the foreground. Yeah, that's Château de Beauregard. And it's sitting on, it looks quite boring because it's actually a flat bit, but the bit just the far side of Château de Beauregard is called Véran. Again, Cras means limestone. And this is a limestone plateau. It's slightly rounded and well drained. But here you make absolutely fantastic firm, fresh mineral wines with this high amounts of limestone. Again, I don't know if you're with your cursor, Tim, you could just go past, yeah, that place there, that is Chateau du Clos, and just behind it, there's a little village of Pouilly. Yeah, exactly. And this is, it's funny, it doesn't look very much, but Pouilly has a lot of soil which is called marne, and marne is a sedimentary clay, and it's laminated, and it produces wines with power, but also fantastic elegance. And so that sort of slightly undistinguished looking place actually makes some of the very, very best Pouilly-Fuissé. And the property Chateau du Clos and the vineyard just in front of it is called Le Pouilly. Yeah, just there, and just in front of it is called Le Pouilly. So that for me is one of the very best Pouilly-Fuissés you make. And again, Tim, I don't know if you could point sort of behind, yeah, that little village there is Solutré. And if you go up to the rock, Tim, behind it, that's the Roche de Solutré. That's where the Stone Age man drove deer over that pointed bit at the end, because it's sort of, the rock sort of narrows to a point in a sort of pyramid, a sort of triangular shape. And again, so maybe if you could just from that rock go far to the right, even further, and yes, that rock in shadow is the rock of Vergisson, and Vergisson is a very, very high village. As I said, you know, you've got Pouilly-Solutré, you've got Vergisson, which is there. Vergisson is the highest, and it's almost the most Côte d'Or-like wine, I think. You have beautiful freshness, altitude, and again, we have wines from Domaine Somez. They have one strangely called Courte Longue, which means sort of short long, and it's absolutely a wonderful, wonderful vineyard.
Toby, if I could just interrupt quickly, we've got a question come through that's quite relevant for what we're talking about at the moment, about Pouilly-Fuissé, and it's from Andrew Melville, and he's asking, given the reputation of Pouilly-Fuissé, why has it not yet got a Premier Cru status?
Oh, well, it's very good timing you asked that question, because from 2020 vintage, it has got Premier Cru. And in fact, Fred Bourrier, who I've been talking about, was the president of the appellation. And they put their dossier in 10 years ago. And as I was saying, you know, it takes a long time from the INAO to get its act together. And I think it's the first Premier Cru vineyards that have been allowed to sort of exist since 1943.
Wow.
So, so with the 2020 vintage, there is an appellation. I'm just looking for my notes. Did I write this down? Yeah, there are 22 Premier Crus, and that equals 194 hectares. It's about a quarter of the appellation. There's 800 hectares in the appellation. So amongst the vines that have been classed as Premier Cru, in the village of Fuissé, there's Le Clos, Les Vignes Blanches, Ménétrières, Les Resses. In Solutré-Pouilly, there is Pouilly, that's the vineyard that we showed you a little while. Véran, which is the limestone plateau on which Château de Beauregard rests. Also Auboutière. In Vergisson, Sur la Roche, Marichaude, and Les Crêts are Premier Crus. And in Chantrey, the other village, the Clos de Monsieur Nolly, Aucar, and Clos Russier were classified. So yeah, very good question. What's quite interesting about Pouilly-Fuissé is, in fact, you can see that the landscape is quite variable. You have hills, you have plateaus, and you have vineyards in all different expositions, which is quite different from, say, the Côte d'Or, which is this escarpment which basically faces east or southeast in the Côte de Beaune. And most of the vineyards are aligned in the same position, which is mainly east or southeast. So that's a very beneficial exposition to get maximum sunlight. Whereas in the Mâconnais and you have these hills, these plateau, and so it's a bit more complicated. And so basically the vineyards that have been classified Premier Cru sort of follow the basic mantra, which is that they should be facing south or southeast. They should be no more than 350, roughly 350 meters altitude. And they should be from basically clay limestone soils. So yeah, that's new. I have certain reservations about it. For me, I mean, it's very difficult for the INAO because they're doing a new classification. But because of global warming, the old diktat that, the vineyards facing southeast are the best, because in the 40s and 50s, one struggled to ripen things. So precocity was a great advantage. So many vintages have been spoiled by October rains. So the southeast facing slopes got their grapes ripe before the rains. But with global warming, that's not the case. And for example, in Vergisson, there are two good growers, which I have mentioned in passing already. One of them, Sermez, they have this vineyard called Courtelong, and also Barrault also has some in Courtelong. And Courtelong, basically, Vergisson is very high, and Courtelong faces north. But it's actually quite sheltered vineyard, and actually it produces Sermez's best wine. But because it's facing north, it wasn't classified as a Premier Cru. Also, there's another lovely property called Château de Ronté. We might be able to show you a photograph of Claire and Fabio, who are architects, and it's Claire's family property, and she met Fabio when she was training to be an architect, I think, in Rome. And they have an amazing site, which is very high up, and its vineyard is slightly facing north. And again, it makes some of the most elegant and beautiful wines that we buy every year. But because it was facing north, and because it was a bit too high up, there they are. He's obviously Italian. Claire, the property is owned by Claire. And I think we have a photograph, I think, of their cellars, which shows you that they're using both, you can see both the traditional Pièce, the 228 litre barrel, and at the end you can see some foudres, which I was referring to previously. I mean, they've come back right into fashion, and particularly for the slightly lesser wines where you don't want too much oxygen or too much oak, they're a very, very nice way of fermenting and storing wine. Well, I think I've perhaps gone on for long enough. I don't know if there are any questions. Perhaps I could hand back to Catherine. Otherwise, I'm very happy to carry on talking. Catherine, do you have a few questions?
Plenty of questions, yes. And I think the first one that we'll have to address, and we've had a lot of members ask, and I think it leads on from what we were talking about with climate change, is the frost that's currently having an impact on the vineyards over, in a lot of Europe and even closer to home in the English vineyards. So is that, obviously spring frosts are something that aren't uncommon and winemakers are prepared to deal with them, but is it something that we're seeing happen so much more frequently and with so much more aggressiveness now? And is that a real cause for concern?
Yes, it is. I mean, as you say, spring frosts have been around for ages. But what's happening now is that with global warming, there's a much, much warmer March. And so the vines start to bud, and then because also the weather is more chaotic, you get a frost. And there was a very terrible one last Tuesday and Wednesday. It went down to -7, I think, in the worst bits, and that's almost something that you can't really, even with helicopters and smudge pots and bougie, you can't really stop that. It's just too strong. Aspersion might work. I mean, Chablis in a real bowl. Sorry, my phone's going.
That's all right. We've just got some images, actually, just sharing now, which shows a lot of well, this will be an aerial view of the bougies and the fires that have been lit in the vineyards to try and counteract the frost damage. And we're just sharing the one that you had on your Instagram as well, Toby.
Yeah,
so
that's two on the rows with the sun coming up on the morning of the last Wednesday. Yes, and it's affected the whole of Europe and the south of France, and it's affected Germany, Italy. I think everywhere. Yeah, I mean, it's a serious problem. I mean, I think I was speaking to a couple of growers this morning, and they said really that you have to wait a bit of time until growth starts. The really seriously frosted buds have turned grey or black, and you can see already the damage. But for the rest, you need to wait really a couple of weeks to see if the buds have been so damaged that they grow or not. And then you have secondary and tertiary buds, which can sprout, but are normally much less fruitful. So it's too early to say with any certainty. I mean, a lot of growers are insured against frost, but it only covers really. It normally covers, according to Christophe Cordier I was speaking to, it covers the cost of what you would pay to rent the land. So it doesn't cover all the costs that you would incur in lost production. But it's pretty serious. People don't know how big it is. It's maybe 30-40%. Chardonnay buds slightly earlier than Pinot. So in the Côte d'Or, the Chardonnay is more affected than the Pinot. But it's pretty serious. I mean, I could imagine it could be 30 or 40%. We have one grower who's pretty smart, Jean-Marc Vincent in Fontenay, and one of the few ways of trying to stop frost is to prune very, very late. The later you prune, the more you delay bud burst. And he actually pruned pretty late. And he had bougie, he had these sort of candles, wax candles that you light. He's not sure, again, he has to wait and see, but he reckons he may have only lost 20%. We'll see. But this technique of delaying, it's very difficult because you can't delay pruning everything, because if you have a large domain, you've got to start at one point. But you can manage things like doing a sort of a pre-pruning. You know, you can get rid of most of the wood and then just leave some of the shoots, which you will attach to the wire later when you prune. But it's a big problem. It's a big problem.
Quite limited in, what they can actually use to kind of counteract the effect? Obviously, we've said about bougies, you know, some winemakers will use sort of across the vineyards, we use the helicopters to keep the warm air moving. But I suppose there is a limitation in what they can do. We've had some conversation in the chat about whether there's any sort of new technology that could be used. But again, that would be an investment. So is that something that you think winemakers should be looking towards to making that investment now, as it's likely something that will unfortunately...
Chablis have been trialing a number of things. I mean, aspersion works quite well. That's when you spray water onto the vines, and curiously, the water freezes around the buds, but when it freezes, it releases a little bit of energy, and it just protects the buds. It just keeps them above 0 degrees. So that's effective, but you spray an awful lot of water everywhere, which I think increases yields quite a lot because there's a lot of water. The other thing they've tried in Chablis is passing electric currents through the fruiting wire, and that heats up and just gives enough energy to protect the bud. But that sort of works when it's 1 or 2 degrees centigrade minus, and it costs an awful lot of money because it's a lot of energy. And the other thing they tried in Chablis was actually, they call it la bâche, which you might say is tarpaulin, but it's like a sort of cloche where they put sort of, you know, this sort of horticultural fleece over it. And that seemed to work, but it seemed also to give a bit like the effect of a cloche. It gave those people who used it a sort of a week or so's extra advanced ripening, which the ENO decided was not fair because you're modifying the terroir, you know. I think the thing is, when it's like 1 or 2 degrees, you know, which the French say gelée de printemps, and that you can protect with most of these methods. But the one on, I think the one on Tuesday and Wednesday last week were polar frosts, where you have this mass of very, very cold air. And in fact, it's actually, it can be very cold, even quite high up. Often, you know, they say that cold air drains. But that really, they could do nothing about really, because it was -6, -7, and the techniques don't allow you. But I think the one on Thursday was what they call, you know, white frost or gelée de printemps. And that you can sort of protect by bougie and also by burning straw bales. I mean, again, it's not very ecological, because you're burning straw, often damp straw, partly for the heat, but partly to produce a cloud. Because with the frost, it's a bit like when you have your central heating pipes frozen. It's not actually the freezing that causes the problem. It's the unfreezing of it, because as it unfreezes, it expands, and in a bud, it ruptures all the cells. So you know, the coolest point is normally about 5 or 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, just when the sun rises. And often when you've had a frosty night, it's because the sky is clear. And if on the morning you then get a beautiful sunlight, the sun, and also it's on the best slopes, normally your best vines get the sunlight, which normally is beneficial the rest of the year, but after a frost, it will suddenly warm up and it will burst the cell walls. So producing all this smoke from damp straw actually puts clouds between your vines and the sun. And I think we did it a couple of years ago in 2018, about the same time, actually, the 5th of April, it was a terrible frost also. And the good burghers of Beaune complained because there was a massive sort of cloud of dark carbon dioxide combustion from the straw bales that they've been burning. So yeah, it's terrible. It looks like, you know, global. It's one of the possible problems with global warming. Yeah, tricky.
It really does bring it home, doesn't it? That it's very agricultural, which I think sometimes we forget when we're, you know, opening a nice bottle of wine. You kind of forget the work that goes into it, and, you know, everyone running about in the vineyards and trying to make sure that everything is.
It takes hours to lay out all those candles and to light them, and then someone lights them probably 2 o'clock in the morning, and they have to be up until 6 or 7, and then you know, if there isn't any frost, they sort of normally have to remove them, because they may be having to plow or do things, but you can't do that if you've got these lines of smudge pots in the way. You have to remove them, and then you know, they've got a few minor frosts this week, so they're putting out smudge pots I think tonight, and there are 2 or 3 nights this week. I think it's going to be less, more like 2 or 3 degrees. But still, it's an awful lot of time to spend. Certainly they're very expensive. It takes a long time to put them out and take them back in again, you know, and also, you know, you've spent 4 hours of the night
trying to save your crop.
Yeah.
I think, you know, thinking then on wanting to, obviously Burgundy fans, and wanting to kind of support that and buy more, other than Saint-Véran, where would you say would be your sort of top 3 villages to consider? If you have,
I'd definitely go by grower, because, as I said, I mean, appellation is interesting. You know, I think again, I mean, I would, you know, I think one of the best value wines we do is Talmar Mâcon-Villages. I mean, I think that's an absolute star. It's, as I said, we don't have enough to keep in stock all year, so that's coming back, I think, in May, and the 2020 is lovely. Also Jean-François Gornand, the Mâcon, La Roche-Vineuse. Again, we don't get a lot of that, but that's super. I think the Cordier Mâcon au Bois d'Allier, which is fermented and matured in a foudre, it's about £13.50. I think that's terrific. I mean, I would say, you know, anything really from, well, we select very good growers, but I mean, Cordier and Bourrier, I think, are fantastic. I mean, anything by them is really super. You know, I think it's difficult to go wrong in the Mâconnais. I mean, hopefully I've made a good selection, and, you know, you get what you pay for as you climb up. But I do think they're world-beating wines. So I think you can't really go wrong, I think.
Perfect. We've had a question from John Crawford, who has asked whether you could say a few words about the characteristics of the last 3 vintages, and of those, sort of, which will age best and which would be ready soonest to drink.
18, 19, 20 in whites, yeah. I haven't tasted many whites because I've been, obviously, with confinement, and I you know, I would normally go out this time of year, just when the malolactic is finished, to taste wines in May, June, May normally in the Mâconnais. So I haven't tasted very many. I think probably they're all quite warm vintages. 18 is the normal size crop, warm, rich. I think it's good. I think probably 19 and 20 are better for whites, although I've tasted very few whites, 20s. 19 is exceptionally good. It's half a crop, it's concentrated, and yet you still have a wonderful freshness and concentration, because the wine seems to have concentrated, and concentrated both the flavor and the acidity. So although they have for wines of quite a ripe flavor, they have very good acidity. So they're often, you know, they're often inversely proportional, you know, ripeness and acidity, but in 19 you've got them both. So I think the 19s are very, very good. I mean, some people are saying the 20s are very, very good, but I've just blended the Sartre's Chablis, and I think that's very, very good. I think it's a little bit fresher than 19. So I probably think that the 20 vintage and Chablis is probably the best of the three. Others are saying, again, 20 is very good in the Côte d'Or and the Mâconnais, but I've tasted very few wines. So I can't personally give you my opinion, but there are people whose palates I respect who say that the 20 is looking very good for whites. 19 probably is the best for reds, having this lovely balance. 18 is very good, slightly rougher tannins. But it seems like 20 could be very, very good for whites, but I think maybe 20, 19 and 18 in that order for whites.
Excellent. And we've had a question from Paul Easton, who would like to know if there's any reds from the Mâconnais that you would recommend.
Not very many that I recommend. There are some. I mean, there's some Gamay and there's some Pinot, and I think there's some sort of mix of the two. But I would really recommend you go. I mean, Pouilly-Fuissé is right on the border of the Beaujolais. So, you know, if you want really good Gamay, you just go a little bit further south. I mean, Beaujolais is amazing value for money. You can get wonderful wines for £7 or £8, and then Crus from, you know, £13, £14. I mean, it's amazing. You know, I do think of Beaujolais as southern Burgundy, and that's really where I think the best value for money comes. There are a few good reds in the Mâconnais, but they tend to be made in tiny quantities, so they're very highly. Some of the good ones are very highly priced for their quality because of supply and demand, in my view. And I'd really prefer to get my Pinots from probably the Côte d'Or or the Côte Chalonnaise. So there are some, but it's a very small percentage of the I don't know, it's 10 or 15%. There's some red and rosé made in the Mâconnais, but not very much. You know, I think the soils on the whole are much better for white wines than red wines. Yeah, I mean, some of the Mâcons, red Mâcons, can be really quite tannic and rustic. But as I said, there are a few very good ones, but because of the supply and demand, I think they're not value for money. So I would say stick to the Côte d'Or for Pinots and go south to Beaujolais for the Gamay.
Lovely. Talking of the Côte d'Or, we've had some questions around wines in sort of contrast to the wines from Burgundy. And we've had a question from Bob Reeves, who has asked whether you could talk a little bit more about minerality, which in Burgundy, perhaps some of the locals would believe makes the wines that bit more interesting than the Côte d'Or. Is that something that you would perhaps agree with or disagree with? And we've also had a lot of people in the chat letting us know that they're actually on a New World Chardonnay this evening. Are there any New World Chardonnays that you think are sort of coming up to par with something you could get from the Mâcon or Burgundy as a whole? Are there any sort of regions or producers that you think are really doing great work in kind of getting that style and character?
Yeah, going back to minerality, it's a funny word, but it's sort of the best one can do to express a style of wine which has persistence and freshness in the mouth, but it doesn't have a lot of fruit. And that's particularly pronounced where you have cool climates and you have a lot of limestone in the soil. So, I mean, I think Chablis perhaps would be the most mineral. I wasn't quite sure what Mr. Reeves meant by. Could you just repeat what he said? Because he said that
I think he is asking that or I think he is suggesting that the minerality is something that sets apart the wines from, sets them apart and makes them that bit more interesting than the wines that are produced in the Côte d'Or. Bob, if that's not what you meant, if you'd like, do clarify in the chat or on the Q&A. But I think
it's just the wines of the Mâconnais are more interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, with that minerality, that's what makes them more interesting.
I wouldn't say that. No, I disagree with that, because I think on the whole that the Mâcon wines are further south, and in fact they taste fruitier and softer and rounder because there's more sunshine and heat. I mean, as I said, there are, where you get streaks of limestone, for example, Véran, the plateau on which Chateau de Beauregard sits, and you could see in the cellar the limestone when Frederick was taking a sample from the barrel. Where you get limestone, that seems to accentuate this minerality. Where you get more clay, you get more richness. So on the whole, Mâconnais has clay and limestone. I think it has less limestone, I would say, than the Côte d'Or. Because in the Côte d'Or, on the whole, where there's more clay, you plant red wines. And in Chablis, I would say probably that's where you get the most of this minerality, because there is limestone there, clay limestone. There's also the climate, which I think reinforces this freshness, this energy, this sort of firm, steely character. Whereas I think in the south, in the Mâconnais, you get more the effect of the sun, the climate. So you get riper fruit. It's more sort of peachy and melon, whereas it's more appley perhaps in Chablis. So I think I would disagree with that, and I would say, there's more fruit ripeness in the Mâconnais. So on the whole, the wines around it.
And in terms of any regions or producers in the New World that are maybe creeping up on the Mâconnais' heels with any wines, is there anyone that you can?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think Cumu River are very interesting. I mean, their basic village Chardonnay is 9.95, which I think is very interesting. Yeah, I think the whole New Zealand movement is very interesting because the wines are much, much less oaky than they used to be. I think there's a very nice balance of things, and there's a lovely freshness in the climate. So I think those are very good. I think some of the top Californian Chardonnays are wonderful. I mean, they're Au Bon Climat, people like that. Mount Eden. I mean, those are up to village level, I think, in the Côte d'Or. In Chile, I mean, Limeri is an amazing place that has limestone, and it has a very, very cool climate, because although it's far to the north, and in Chile that means it's warmer, in fact, the climate is very influenced in Chile by the coastal range. People know about the Andes, which is up to sort of 8,000 meters, but there's also a coastal range which is up to 1,000 meters, which is very, very high. But where there's a gap in the coastal range, you get very cool air from the Pacific, because the Humboldt Current in the Pacific's 12 degrees. And so Limeri has got very cool climate. I mean, it's like Burgundy, and it has a lot of limestone soils. And so for me, we moved our own labels there. So if you taste the Society's Chilean Chardonnay, the Society's Exhibition Chardonnay, we have a very good one called Mycas. Unfortunately, that's Conchitora. They're just disbanding Mycas. There is Tabali have a fantastic vineyard called Talenay, which is actually a limestone terrace. It's unique in Chile, and that's only about, I think, 12 kilometers from the sea. That's in a very coastal part of Limeri, and that makes really fine taut. Again, really quite mineral wines, which aren't the sort of typical fruit bomb New World style at all. So yeah, I mean, I think the New World's getting closer to really good Chardonnay than it is Pinot yet. I think with Pinot still, there's a texture and a style in the best Burgundian Pinots that sets it apart. And they're different animals. Burgundian Pinot is more structured, it's firmer. New World Pinot is a little bit softer and rounder. But I think they are in those particular countries, Chile and New Zealand, I think they're getting much closer to the style. And I think some of them are as good as a Mâconnais. But some of them are probably as expensive or more expensive. I mean, I think one of the things that is very interesting about the two countries is that, I mean, for example, take Chile. I mean, it's planted a lot of vineyards in the last 20 or 30 years. And it takes, and when you plant a vineyard and build a winery, it takes you 40, 50 years, or 30 years to get your money back. Whereas, in the Mâconnais, people have inherited fantastic vineyards from their parents. And vine age is very interesting because as the vines get older, they produce less but better. So you've got some fantastic old vineyards in the Mâconnais, 40, 50, 60 years old, which they didn't have to pay to plant. And so the capital costs are much less. So really, if you buy well in France, you can get world-beating value for money because they haven't had to spend all this money developing a relatively new vineyard.
Yeah, amazing. We've had a lot of really good chat, chat in the chat, conversation in the chat, I think is a clearer way to say it, of members that are definitely planning and considering doing a little trip to the Mâconnais when we're able to move around a bit more freely again. And I think one of the things that's come up quite regularly and is something perhaps quite nice to end on is where would be your favourite place to eat and stay in the Mâcon? Or where is somewhere you really enjoy going when you're on your trips, aside from producers?
It's actually quite difficult because there aren't that many really interesting hotels. I struggle to find hotels. And I find Mâcon, the traffic in Mâcon is quite tricky. I tend to get lost in Mâcon. I try to avoid Mâcon because I end up losing time. There's a very good restaurant in Chantrey, La Table de Chantrey. I think it's still going. It's like one sitting and it's a couple who run it, and there are about 7 or 8 tables, and that's, I don't know what it is, it's maybe Michelin 1 star, but it's wonderful and they have a very good list. There's a very good Michelin starred restaurant in Tournu called Les Terrasses. Otherwise, there are quite a few quite nice but simple restaurants which maybe you wouldn't travel. Ça vaut pas le voyage or whatever, as the Michelin guy would say. You wouldn't perhaps travel to go there, but there are plenty of attractive places to eat. But it perhaps doesn't have the variety that Beaune has. I mean, you can drive from the centre of Beaune to Pouilly-Fuissé in an hour on the motorway. And I would probably base myself in Beaune. That's what I do when I'm traveling. I base myself in Beaune. There are more restaurants and more hotels. And then you can travel down to Pouilly-Fuissé, as I say. And the countryside around there is wonderful. As I said, these Les Roches de Solitaire and Vergisson are beautiful, and you're out in the countryside, and it's wonderful. So, I might try and have a think, but as I said, I would probably base myself in Beaune and then drive down, and you could also drive down to the Chalonnais, the Bouxy. You can go up to the Côte de Nuit. But it's really not very far. It's 60 miles or something down to Pouilly-Fuissé from Beaune, and door to door it's an hour going on the motorway. So it's very easy.
Excellent. I think a lot of people maybe be getting onto Google Maps and a lot of other TripAdvisor perhaps, and having a look and planning their routes for when we can travel. You've heard it from Toby. Place yourself in Beaune and then work out from there. Thank you.
My information is probably a bit out of date, because restaurants can come and go very quickly, and obviously with the shutdown, I mean, many have probably gone bust. I don't know what's happening, and as I said, I haven't travelled now since 2019. So I'm a little bit out of date, probably, but yeah. It's a lovely countryside in the Mâconnais. As I said, it's a bit like Wiltshire, with sun and hedges, and it's very attractive just to drive around. Yeah, do make it down there. It's lovely, and visit also the domains. They're less stuffy than the Côte d'Or domains. Be quite happy to see you, and we can probably help set you up with 1 or 2 vineyard visits as well. Because they're a bit less precious than the Côte d'Or people. So it's well worth a visit down there. It's lovely countryside.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Toby, for that hour. We've gone slightly over, so I do apologise if anyone's had something pressing at 7:30, but thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, members, for joining us as well this evening. I hope you found it as interesting as we have. Will be sending around the maps and images that we used, so you can have a bit of a closer look at those this evening, or tomorrow when you receive the email. As I said at the beginning, we have got some more French events coming up to go with our All the Colours of France offer that's currently live. So do have a look on the website as to what is happening, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Catherine.